So now we have discussed about the NextAuth, that what is the NextAuth, why do we need the NextAuth, how it works and where it can be used. And now inside the next step, now let's see that how to implement the NextAuth. So from this video onwards, now let's see that how we can implement the NextAuth inside the Next.js application. So the first step is very simple. We have the install NextAuth. So we need to install the NextAuth inside our application. So you need to move on into the documentation of the NextAuth. We have the getting started, and from there you can see we have the existing project of the Next.js, and from there we can just install the NextAuth with this command, the npm install and the NextAuth. So you can copy that command over there. Then you can move on and create a brand new Next.js application. So I have just created this application over there. We don't have anything there. If you open the app, if you open the page, you can see it is generated by the Next.js. So I haven't added anything over there. And now let's move on. Let's install the NextAuth over there. So we have the npm install and the NextAuth, and the first step is completed. Now we want to move on to the second step, which is register a catch all API handler endpoint. So now we want to register your endpoint. We want to add an endpoint inside our application, which is a catch all API handler endpoint. So what does this catch all API handler means? So it means the NextAuth by default catches all of the incoming requests made to the NextAuth. So it catches all of the incoming requests. Suppose we send the get request, suppose the post request. So it handles the incoming request automatically, whether it's a get request or whether it's a post request. So one function can accept any of the incoming request. So that is known as the catch all API handler. So let's move on to the Next.js document. So let's move on to the Next.auth documentation. Sorry, we have the add API route, and from there you can see we have these steps over there. So this is showing us for the pages, but now we are using the Next.js 13.2. So let's move on. Let's see about that. So you need to click on this guide to move on to the Next.js 13.2 guide. You can see now we have the app folder. So inside the app, we have the API, then auth. Then after that, we need to create a dynamic slug route. And after that, we need to get the route.ts, which is the incoming route handler file. So we need to create a file inside the app, API auth, and inside the dynamic slug NextAuth. And from there, we want to declare a function of the handler, like we have discussed about this. Inside this, we have the catch all API handler endpoint. So we want to declare this function over there. And then we want to export this function as a get and as a post. So this function is a catch all handler function. So let's move on. Let's implement that. So first we need to import the NextAuth. And from there, let's move on. We can import the NextAuth. But before implementing the NextAuth, you need to make sure that the NextAuth only works for the login. So it only works for the login, and for the sign in, you want to create a separate API endpoint. And as of now, we don't have any database integrated with our application. So what we can do? So we can just create a constant users file in which we'll be having the users object from which we can verify the credentials with the NextAuth. So let's move on. So first, let's move on inside the app folder. We have the API / we can have the auth. Then we have the dynamic slug route. We have the triple dot NextAuth, which is a dynamic slug file. Then we want to create the handler file, which is the route.ts. So here we have this file. And after that, we need to import the NextAuth over there. And now the next step would be, now we want to define the catch all handler function. We can have the handler over there, and that is equals to the NextAuth. So it is the NextAuth over there. And there you can see now we want to provide some options as well for the NextAuth. And after that, now what do we need to do? So we can just export the handler function. So we can have the export, we can have the handler as get, and we can have the handler as post. So Next.js automatically sends those requests, and so NextAuth automatically sends those requests, and it automatically accepts and handles those requests. So we don't need to do, and we don't need to make any requests to the NextAuth. And now what do we want to do as the next step? So inside there, we need to provide the options. So inside there, we need to provide the options. So let's move on. Let's define the options object as well. So we can have the auth options like that. Auth options. So that would be equals to an object. And the type for this would be equals to, we can have the next auth options. So we have the next auth options for the type. And from there, you can see if you again move on to the application, if you again move on to the documentation, you can see now the auth options contain some objects. Like first property that we have is the providers. So the providers are the methods for this sign-in. That's it. So the providers are just the options for the sign-in. That can be username, password, which is the credentials. That can be GitHub login as well. So we have the GitHub provider. Then we can have the Google provider as well for the Google login. And we can have more like that. You can also move on to the provider section over there. You can see these are the providers that you can set up with the NextAuth. So we have the providers over there. So as of now, we'll be working with the credentials provider. So we can move on. So we can just search for the credentials over there. So here we have the credentials. And from there, what we need to do? So first we need to import the credentials provider like that. Then we have the credentials. So what are the credentials which are required for the logging in? So as we discussed earlier that the NextAuth only handles the login purpose. We don't have the sign in purpose there. So what are the credentials that the NextAuth will handle? That can be username and the password. You can have email password as well. Then we have the authorize. So what is the authorize function? So with this authorize function, we authenticate the user. So if the user's password and the email are correct, then we authorize the user. And if the user's password or email is incorrect, then we return the null. So from the authorize function, we return the user object. And if the user object is false, if the credentials are false, then we return the null. So that is the step for this. So let's move on. Let's add the credentials provider there. So inside the auth options, what I'm going to do, so I'm going to import the credentials provider first. So we can move on. So here we have the credentials provider. And what do we need to do as the next step? So here we want to provide the providers, which is a required property there. And it's always an array of the methods of the sign-in. Then we want to provide the credentials provider over there. So here we have the credentials. And from there, what do we want to do? So we can have the name over there. We can give the unique name to the credentials. So we can have the creds like that. Then we can move on. So as we discussed earlier, we need to provide the credentials over there. So the credentials are the options of the sign-in. So one more thing, the NextAuth by default automatically generates a login page for you. So whatever credentials that you provide here, it would automatically create the login page for you. So you can see now we have the credentials for the username and the password. So now we have the credentials for the username and the password for verifying the user's detail. So let's move on. So we'll be using the email over there. So we have the email. And email would be an object. So the Next.js by default generates a file. So we can give the label as well. So with the label, we can have the email. Then we can move on. We can send the placeholder as well. So placeholder can be, we can have the enter email. And now we want to add the password as well. So we can copy that. We can paste that over there. So that should be equals to, we can have the password like that. So that should be label. We can have the password over there. Then we can have the placeholder. That can be, we can have the password like that. And now after the credentials, now the final thing which is required, we want to add the authorize, which authenticates the user. So let's move on to the authorize, and this can be an asynchronous function as well because it returns a promise. So we can have the async over there, which is the async authorize. And the credentials have all of the things. Like you can see, you have provided the email and the password, and the credentials have the email and the password over there. And the request is the actual request object that you can get. So after the authorize, now we want to authenticate the user. So once the user enters the credentials and once the user signs in, so then the authorize function gets called. And from there, if the user's details are correct, then we move on. And if the user's details are incorrect, then we return the null from the authorize and the authentication would be stopped. So that's the process. So now let's move on. So as we discussed earlier, so we don't have the database as of now. So we can move on into the application directory. We can create a new file. We can have the helpers. And from the helpers, we can have the constants file. We have the constants.ts. And from there, we can just export the user object from there, which can contain the email and the password. So that can be an array of the objects as well. So it's up to you. So we can have the const. We can have the users like that. So that's an array. So each array can contain, we can have the ID. We can have that should be 1. And we can move on. We can have a name as well. Name we can have, suppose we can have the James over there. Then we can move on. We can have the email as well. So email can be James at that we can have the test.com. Then we can have the password as well. So we can have the password. We can have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So here we have the password. We can create another user object as well. We can copy that. We can paste and we can move on. So we have the second object over there. We can have the Mary. And then we can move on. We can have the Mary at the rate test.com. We can have the password. We can have 000111. So we have this password over there. So now we have 2 users. So this is our database for now. This is a simple database. Now we can move on and we can import the constants over there. So what do we need to do? So first inside the authorize, you can move on. You can verify if the credentials are there or not. If the credentials are null, then you don't need to move ahead. So you can have the property. So you can have the validation, like if you don't have the credentials, so if you don't have the credentials, or if you don't have the credentials.email, and if you don't have the credentials password, then what you can do, so you can move on, you can just return the null. So you can return the null over there that the details are incorrect. So we have the null over there. So now we have the credentials, now we have the email and the password. Now we can move on and we can verify the details. So let's move on. So we can have the const, we can have the user, that should be equals to, so we can have the users like that. So we have the users inside the helper. Then we can have the find. So we can use the find function from the array. And from there, we can have the user object like that. Or we can have the item like that. Dot, we can have the email. So that should be equals to the credentials dot email. So we can find the user object by this. So now we have the user object. Now what do we need to do as the next step? So now we have the user, and now we can verify the password of the user. So we can move on. So we can have the if check, like if the user dot password equals to, we have we have the credentials dot password. So if the password is correct, then what we can do, so we can just return the user property. So we can return the whole user object. And if it is not correct, then we can move on. We can return the null over there like this. So that's how the authorize function works. So you can see now we have the authorize function over there. So inside the authorize, first we are checking the validation. Then we are finding the user associated with that email. Then we are verifying the password. Then we are returning the user property if everything is fine. Else we are returning the null over there. And now let's move on. So here you can see now we don't have any errors inside the file. We don't require the request as well. So now we have the credentials provider, which is working fine. And now let's move on and let's just add the auth options here inside the next auth. So here we have the auth options and everything should work perfectly fine. So with this step, now you have integrated the next auth inside your Next.js application. And now next thing would be, you can see if we just move on into the PPT, now we have the use any number of providers. Now we have used the credentials provider. You can also use Google and the GitHub as well. So we will see that inside our next couple of videos. And now let's move on and let's just try this sign in option. So let's move on. So we can move on. We can start the application server. So let's move on. We can start the application on the local development server. We can have the npm run dev and let's move on inside this. And from there, we can move on to the localhost 3000. So let's see what happens. So it has compiled. So now it has compiled the page and it is working fine. And now we want to move on to the API auth. Then we want to move on to the sign in. So inside the next auth, there are a couple of pages which are provided to you. So you can get all of the pages from it. Like you can move on to the documentation to find all of that pages. So the main page that we have is the sign in page. So you can move on. So you can have the API/auth, then you can have this sign in. So here you have this page over there and you can see it is working fine. And as we discussed earlier that the next auth automatically creates the login page. So you can see it has created that. We have email and the password. And then we have the sign in as well with the sign in with credits. So the credits is the name of this name. You can see you have provided the name. If you change the name, then it will change here. So you have the sign in with credits and there you can see now you can provide the details over there. And now let's move on. Let's log in. So you can see we have the user objects over there. We have the james@test.com and we have the password of the 123456. So let's move on. Let's copy that over there. We have this over there. We can paste that over there. Now we can move on. We can copy the password. We can paste that. And now let's move on to the inspect panel as well to see if we find something inside the console window. So let's move on. If you open the network as well, if we click on the sign in with credits, once again, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. If we click on the sign in with credits, you can see now we are into the home page. But why? If we move on to the network access once again, if we move on to the network and if we again reload the home page, so let's see what happens. If we reload that, you can see now if you move on to the application tab over there, inside the cookies, you got something. Like here you can see inside the cookies, you got some data. You got the session token, you got the CSRF token, then you got the next.auth callback URL. So you can see everything seems to be fine. Now you have the session token over there. So it means now the user is logged in. If you have the session token, it means the user is logged in. So now we can move on. And if we just try deleting the cookies, if we just move on to the application, if we just try deleting all of the cookies, if we just refresh once again, and if we just move on to the API auth sign in once again, so let's see. Now, if we provide the incorrect details, like we have the james@test.com, but we provided different password. If we just click on the sign in with credits, now you can see now we have this sign in failed. Check the details you provided are correct. And if we provide exact details, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, if we click on the sign in with credits, then you can see now we have this session token over there and everything seems to be working perfectly fine. And there you can see, you can move on to the credentials as well. You provided these credentials. So this CRF So this CSRF token was generated, and then you can see everything seems to be fine. And now you can see now the NextAuth login has been successful. You can see the sign in has been worked. So you can see now the sign in has been worked. And now let's see that how we can add the secret and the callbacks. So we want to add the secret of the Next.js. You can see inside the terminal, you can see you are seeing the warning of the NextAuth like no secret. So this secret is required in the NextAuth because with the help of this secret, it generates the JWT tokens. So you can move on, you can generate the secret as well. So you can have the secret over there, and you can generate the secret inside the process dot environment and inside the next auth secret. So we can have the next auth, we can have this secret like that. We have the next auth secret, and after that you can create an environment file as well. You can have .env file, and there you can have the next auth secret as well. So you can move on, you can copy the secret over there. Now we have the secret, and that should be any string which is very hard to remember. So here I have this secret. So you can see now we have the secret, which is easy to remember, but we can improve that. We can have QWER, we can use any numbers like that. So now we have the next auth secret. Now you can see now we have added that secret as well inside the route file. If we move on to the route, so here you can see now we have the process.environment.nextAuth secret. Now we can move on into the page file. So you can see now it's a server component, and now let's see that how we can get the session details inside the server component over there. So let's move on. So here you can see now we have the hello over there. Now we can move on. So we have a function inside the NextAuth from where we can just get the server session. So we can have the const, we can have the data. So that should be equals to, we can have the get server session. So this function is there inside the NextAuth. So we can import that as well. So we can have the import, we can have something that should be equals to, we can have the NextAuth / we can have the next. And the function name that we have is we can have the get server session. And after that, what do we need to do? So we have the get server session, but inside the get server session, because it's a server component, so it is not inside the client. So we need to provide the authentication options here as well. So the options that we have defined over there, like we have defined the options here. So we need to export these options from here. And if we need to use the get server session, then we want to provide the options here. So we can have the auth option like that over here. And then we can move on, we can use the await here as well. So here we have the await to get the details of the get server session, because it's an asynchronous component. So we can get the details over there. And now we can just check everything. So you can see now we have the users, and now everything should work fine. Now we have the authentication secret as well. Now you can see now we can move on. We have the auth options over there. We have the secret. We have everything with that. Now let's move on into the page. You can see it's a server component. Now we are getting the details. And now let's see that how we can just get the details. We can have the JSON dot, we can have the stringify. That should be equals to the data itself. So now let's see what happens. So you can see initially we have the null, but if we move on to, we can have the /API auth and the sign in. If we provide the email, the james@test.com, if we provide the password, if we just click on sign in with credentials, so you can see now we are getting the user details. You can see now we are getting the session details of the user. We have the user, which we have the name, which is equals to James. We have the email as well, which is the james@test.com. So you can see that's how it works. You can see now we are getting the session details of the user. You can see the page is also generated over there. Now we are getting the session details, and everything seems to be working perfectly fine. So now we have accessed the session details via the server component. So now let's see that how we can do that with the client component. So with the client component, as per the NextAuth, so we need to use a provider. So we need to use a provider which can be a context provider from which we can get the session details. So if we move on to the documentation of the NextAuth, so here we have the NextAuth. So it is mentioned that we need to use the providers to get the session details if we want to use the session inside the client components. You can see here we have the client component. You can see we need to use a session provider component, which is available inside the NextAuth / React. Then we can move on. We have this session over there. So we already get the session inside that. Then we can send this session. So let's see that how we can implement it here. So let's comment it now. And now we can move on. We can just create a new folder. And inside there, we need to create a new component that you can have the auth provider like that. So you can have the auth, we can have the provider like that. Dot, we can have the TSX. So it's a component. And after that, it's a client component. So we need to use the use client at the top. So we have the use client over there. So as the next step, we want to use a session provider. So we can move on. We can have the const, we can have the auth provider like that. So that should be equals to a function. And inside there, now we want to return something. So inside there, we want to return the JSX code. So we can have the return, we can have the session provider. So we can use the session provider directly from the next.auth/react. So we have the session provider, and this component would automatically get children over there. So we get the children, and the children we want to define the type as well. So we have the children over there, and it is of type of, we can have the react.node. So we have the react dot, we can have the react node, we can have that, we have the react.react node. So now we want to render the children that we get from the auth provider. And now let's move on. So we can just export auth provider as a default export. So we can have the export default, that should be equals to the auth provider like that. So now we have the auth provider. And now what do we want to do as the next step? So now we can move on into the root layout. So here we have the root layout of our application, and from there now we want to wrap the whole children which are being generated by the pages. Now we want to move on, we need to wrap the session provider over there. So here we can define the main tag over there. So we can have the main. After the main, we can use the provider. And now we want to wrap the whole children with the auth provider like this. And now we can move on into the page.tsx, and now we can make this component as a client component. So we can have the use, we can have the client over there. So if you want to get the session data inside the client component, so we have a hook. So we can have the const, we can have something that should be equals to, we can have the use session hook. So we can have the use, we can have the session hook, and it should be imported from the next.auth once again. So we can move on. So we can have the import, we can have something that should be equals to from, we can have the next.auth/react, and we need to import the use session hook. And after that, we'll be having the use session over there. So here we have the use session, and something that we want to import, we can import the data, we can import the status, we can use the update as well. So let's import the data, and let's just log the data over there. So we have the data like that, and we can stringify the data as well. So we can move on. So we can have the JSON dot, we can have the stringify like that. So let's see what happens if we save and if we move on. The async await is not, I think we have, so we forgot to remove the async over there. So we can remove the async. If we move on to the application, you can see now we have the session details of the user, and everything seems to be working perfectly fine. And if I just slow down the network, if I have this slow 3G, then you can see initially the blank page would be generated. Then it will make a request to the next.auth to get the session details. You can see now it will make the request to get the session details, and that's how it works. You can see after a couple of seconds, now we'll be seeing the details. If we just move on, we have a fast 3G, then we would be getting the details inside there. So now we should be seeing the session over there. Now we have the session, and from there you can say now we have the user property, user email and the name. Then we are seeing the details. So it means everything seems to be working fine. So now with this step, you can see now the last step has also been completed. So now we have successfully integrated the NextAuth inside our Next.js web application, and it is working perfectly fine. Now we have installed the NextAuth, we have registered the endpoint, we have used the credentials provider, we have the sign in, we have the callbacks, we have the secret. So we don't have the callbacks yet, but we can add the callbacks later. Then we have the secret, then we can access it via the server and the client components, and everything seems to be working perfectly fine. So that's it for this video, and inside the next video, we will be focusing on integrating this application with the database. So we can use the Prisma and the MongoDB database to integrate it with the NextAuth. So let's wrap up this lecture.